George Orwell's 1984 is well known and often referenced in contemporary culture, though frequently by people that don't seem to have read it. 1984 and Big Brother have become cultural shorthand for oppressive government, mass surveillance, and the manipulation of the populace through mass media. It's our go-to dystopia. But 1984 only shows us one perspective on oppressive totalitarian systems. Written by an Englishman, Eric Blair, better known as George Orwell, in the 1940s, it's a view from outside, looking at the brute force mechanisms of control and coercion. Orwell had direct experience of these movements in the Spanish Civil War, but he did so as a foreigner, and that outside view is the foundation of his perceptions of that war, and by extension, the totalitarian movements that fought it. To have a more complete concept of such systems, we need to look at 1984 alongside other works that explore it from different angles. Yevgeny Zamyatin's 1924 novel We is an obvious companion piece, written more than 20 years before Orwell's dystopian classic. It is marinated in the revolutionary fervor of the early Soviet Union, which naturally would not allow its publication, and just as naturally couldn't entirely stop it. In the broad strokes, the two books are remarkably similar. Both follow a character engaged in technical work. 1984's Winston Smith rewrites history on behalf of the Ministry of Truth. Does that make him a journalist by today's standards? While We's protagonist, named D503, is a mathematician in the service of the one state, working on a project they call the integral. Both live in a totalitarian society that watches them at all times and eliminates anyone that steps out of line. 1984 has the thought police, We has the guardians, but their function is the same. Both men are chosen by a subversive woman that they simultaneously hate and desire, a woman that introduces them to new knowledge like a sort of Eve figure. And in both cases, they meet in a secret place for sex, consumption of black market goods like coffee, and she tries to dress like a woman instead of a sexless coverall-clad party comrade. Compare this from 1984 between Julia and Winston in their secret apartment after Julia has revealed the sugar and coffee she managed to pilfer. She must have slipped into some shop in the proletarian quarters and bought herself a complete set of makeup materials. Her lips were deeply reddened, her cheeks rouged, her nose powdered. There was even a touch of something under the eyes to make them brighter. Compare to this from We between D503 and I330 in their secret meeting place. I turned. She was in a light saffron yellow dress of the ancient model. This was 1,000 times more cruel than if she had worn nothing. In both cases they get caught, and in the end the protagonist gets so mind-fucked by the regime's highly advanced brainwashing that they love their oppressor. Big Brother in 1984, and the benefactor in We. Orwell's story achieves this through torture, so that when Winston is finally executed for his crimes, he gazed up at the enormous face. 40 years it had taken him to learn what kind of smile was hidden beneath the dark mustache. Oh, cruel, needless misunderstanding. Oh, stubborn, self-willed exile from the loving breast. 2 gin-scented tears trickled down the sides of his nose. But it was all right. Everything was all right. The struggle was finished. He had won the victory over himself. He loved Big Brother. While Zamyatin depicts the same being accomplished with a surgical operation. There we were tied to the tables and subjected to the great operation. On the following day, I, D503, went to the benefactor and told him everything I knew about the enemies of happiness. How could it have seemed so difficult before? Incredible. The only explanation I can think of is my former sickness, the soul. But in detail is where the differences are interesting. Perhaps most notably, We, written by a man who lived through the Bolshevik Revolution, ends with the one state in the process of losing control. There's fighting in the streets, the wall sealing them off from the natural world has been breached, and the state is in a race against time to subject the population to the operation, a medical procedure to remove the imagination and make them good, productive citizens again, before the whole system collapses under the strain. Both Orwell and Zamyatin wrote from a place of opposition. Orwell as a socialist who nevertheless recognized the potential for abuse. He wasn't some pampered scion of the privileged class. He had real-world experience shaping his perspective. And he wasn't dazzled by Stalin's Soviet Union like some of his contemporaries. Zamyatin lived through the revolution and the Leninist effort to impose communism. Shortages and secret police and neighbors denouncing each other weren't abstract concepts to him, and consequently, the two writers criticized this type of regime from different perspectives. But before delving deeper into the details and differences in these two condemnations of technocratic totalitarianism, we need a counterpoint. Things to Come, released in 1936, was based closely on a book written by self-described socialist and world government aficionado H.G. Wells, and the film is essentially an uneasy collaboration between Wells and director William Cameron Menzies, whose impact on filmmaking is a whole other topic. The film tells the story of a world war lasting decades, the collapse of industrial civilization, and the rebirth of the world under the guidance of scientific management and enlightened collectivism. This is sort of a fanboy approach to technocratic totalitarianism. The technocratic idea grew in part out of an interplay between American industry and Soviet ideology. We tend to think of Soviet factories as being these sprawling compounds of furnaces and assembly lines where workers toil under watchful eyes looking for deviations from the prescribed methods. And this isn't entirely wrong, but what's notable is that they got it from us. American factories, most notably the Ford Motor Company, adopted the ideas of scientific management as developed by Frederick Winslow Taylor, ideas that became known as Taylorism and which inspired Soviet thinkers and became foundational to their rapid industrialization. The basic premise is that small improvements in efficiency of individual tasks can add up to significant increases in productivity. For example, if a worker at a particular assembly station frequently uses an 1/8-inch flathead screwdriver, and it takes him 4 seconds to open his drawer, look at the tray, and remove that tool, that can add up to several minutes of non-productive time over a day, several hours over a year multiplied across the entire factory staff, all wasted time. So instead, the screwdriver would be kept on a chain hanging at the level of the worker's hand so that it only takes him half a second to grab it. This kind of efficiency squeezing spread over every task of every worker in a large factory translates to a significant increase in productivity over time. Whether it's Ford trying to maximize profits or Gastev trying to fulfill the goals of the third five-year plan, the premise is essentially the same. But where American capitalism used scientific management merely as a means of extracting more labor and increasing profit, some Soviet thinkers, like Alexei Gastev, approached it more as a way of structuring society as a whole. We directly builds on this, mentioning Taylorism specifically, expanded from the factories into every aspect of society. The Great Table lays out how every moment of the day shall be spent for the collective good, down to how long a bite of food should be chewed before swallowing. It's worth noting that Alexei Gastev, the director of the Soviet Union's Central Institute for Labor and a poet of sorts, pushed for this same approach to language, stripping it of florid prose in favor of the most direct and simple statements, foreshadowing Orwell's Newspeak. It sounds, well, Orwellian to us, but there were and are people that support the basic idea of technocratic rule, of applying scientific management to national politics and daily life. What is the appeal? Things to Come gives an answer to that. The old world, our world, is full of war, disease, hunger, and general unpleasantness. If society can be directed by benevolent and wise leaders according to rational scientific principles, then we can have perpetual peace and prosperity. It makes a lot of assumptions that don't actually work in the world, but that's one of the hallmarks of collectivism of all stripes. What's important here is that totalitarians and collectivists, whether communists or fascists, generally aren't trying to impose misery and war. A few opportunists aside, most of them honestly believe that tight control of society under their principles will lead to good outcomes. They think they're building a better world. That's what Things to Come shows us. The optimism of totalitarianism.
For now, we have to put the world in order. It will be a long and complicated struggle, but we have the unity of a common order and a common knowledge.
Things to Come begins in 1936, with war looming on the horizon. It's a war that drags on for decades, destroying civilization. Hunger, plagues, and warlords spread across the land until a mysterious visitor arrives in an aircraft that is most definitely not a leftover from the war. This visitor, a man named John Cabal, informs the local chief that his days are over and the technocratic blackshirts are going to remake the world whether he likes it or not.
We don't approve of independent sovereign states.
You don't approve?
We mean to stop them,
That's war.
if you will.
Well, now we've got a chance to try the new gas of peace on somebody.
After their victory, these conquering men of technology build cities, new machines, push the boundaries of science, and deliver a world of peace and prosperity, just as they had promised. The only problem they have is that some of them have become too conservative and want to slow down the rate of glorious progress.
Suppose someone cried, "Halt! Stop this progress!" Suppose I shouted to the world, "Make an end to this progress." I could talk.
Things to Come has clear echoes of the totalitarian movements of the 1930s when it was written, before those movements had become cultural shorthand for tyranny. George Orwell, during the war, said of it, "Much of what Wells has imagined and worked for is physically there in Nazi Germany. The order, the planning, the state encouragement of science, the steel, the concrete, the airplanes are all there, but all in the service of ideas appropriate to the Stone Age." More recent and subtle, there's a William Gibson story, The Gernsback Continuum, about a photographer hired to document decaying 30s-era futurist architecture. He starts having hazy visions of this things to come type world as though it exists in some parallel timeline and is bleeding through. Gibson specifically addresses the Nazi parallels of this 1930s futurism infused with technocratic ideas as his character sees a couple from that world beside the road. They were white, blonde, and they probably had blue eyes. They were American. D'Alta had said that the future had come to America first, but had finally passed it by. But not here, in the heart of the dream. Here we'd gone on in a dream logic that knew nothing of pollution, the finite bounds of fossil fuel, or foreign wars it was possible to lose. They were smug, happy, and utterly content with themselves and their world. And in the dream, it was their world. Looking to the Soviet Union, we see a similar spirit of uniformity and techno-supremacy in the poetry of Alexei Gastev. "In my veins flowed the blood of a new railway. I grew myself higher, began to sprout firm hands and immense steel shoulders. I merged with the iron construction. I arose." It probably flows a little better in Russian. The organizational ideas behind Things to Come are the same collectivist ideas behind 1984 and We. In Things to Come, the dream of their success is presented, while Orwell and Zamyatin echo the failures of their real-world implementation. But it's not the same echo. The view of technological progress is very different between We and 1984. Zamyatin depicts an oppressive world, but one where technical progress continues. Orwell, on the other hand, suggests a stagnant system. His tri-party forever war between Oceania, East Asia, and Eurasia implies a near-total stagnation. Any advance that gives any power a significant advantage could lead to destabilizing the military stalemate, and with it the entire social and political order that the endless wars prop up in all three belligerent states. The difference makes sense if we think about it. Zamyatin saw the Soviet Union from the inside, and he witnessed the massive burst of industrialization that came with the new regime. From that inside perspective, the communist regime brought rapid progress in productivity and technical capacity. Orwell was English. His country had been heavily industrialized for his entire life. From that perspective, Soviet advances were just catching up, and in reality, Soviet industrialization was heavily dependent on technicians and machinery from Western Europe and the United States. For example, that time the Soviets bought an entire factory from Ford and had it shipped over, which is a great story on its own. This is reflected in the world building of these stories. We has the city surrounded by a wall, ostensibly to keep the chaotic natural world out. But as the story progresses, we see that it's more about keeping people in, about constraining the parameters of thought. Things to Come echoes this, with their cities being built down into the ground, sheltered from unpredictable nature inside their climate-controlled habitat.
The age of windows lasted 4 centuries. I never seemed to realize that we could light the interiors of our houses with sunshine of our own, so there was no need to stick them up ever so high into the air.
It's also worth noting that both We and Things to Come revolve around a project to launch people into space. In We, it's something called the Integral that the character D503 is the chief designer of, while Things to Come depicts a space gun built outside the city. I always smile when I see the giant front sight, like there's a guy standing on the ground trying to aim it at the moon. 1984 has no big scientific project unless we count their surveillance and torture methods. Things to Come is triumphalist.
But for man, no rest and no ending. He must go on, conquest beyond conquest. First this little planet and its winds and waves, and then all the laws of mind and matter that restrain it.
While 1984 is essentially hopeless.
If you want a vision of the future, Winston, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever.
And between them is we, showing a totalitarian world enclosed by walls, but walls that can be breached. There is beauty outside the walls. There are people living out there. We has hope, not only for the future, but for the individual, despite the oppressive system trying desperately to maintain its control. We also reflects our modern systems of social control better than the overt brutality of 1984. For example, the one state holds elections for the benefactor. Naturally, this is entirely unlike the disorderly, disorganized elections of the ancients, when, absurd to say, the very results of the elections were unknown beforehand. Building a state on entirely unpredictable eventualities, blindly. What can be more senseless? And yet, apparently, it needed centuries before man understood this. They call it Unanimity Day, a celebration of their oneness, of our democracy, you might say. The elections themselves are mainly symbolic, meant to remind us that we are a single mighty million-celled organism that, in the words of the ancients, we are the church, one and indivisible. Because the history of the one state knows of no occasion when even a single voice dared to violate the majestic unison. Things to Come isn't that far removed. Their city-state is led by Oswald Cabal, son of the founder John Cabal. It seems that Cabal is always in charge one way or another. In all of these cases, we are presented with a society ruled according to a particular vision, a society that goes to great lengths to shield itself from outside influences. These three visions of a future, along with many others that I haven't talked about, take different approaches to the underlying truth that all collectivist ideologies attempt to impose their vision at the expense of the individual. Grand collective visions for directing the whole of society are inherently anti-individualist to some extent. Dystopias like 1984 and We show us the extreme. When man's freedom equals zero, he commits no crimes. That is clear. The only means of ridding man of crime is ridding him of freedom. The dystopias are meant as a warning and sometimes as a critique, but dystopias are easy to dismiss because they are so extreme. Together with their utopian mirrors, we get a better sense of what these ideas are really about. The central element is centralization, the consolidation of power. Whether presented in the glowing things to come utopian manner, or the Orwellian sense of a movement with initially noble ends being co-opted by power-hungry tyrants, which he implies in 1984 with Goldstein as a sort of Trotsky figure and makes explicit in Animal Farm, the end result is always a small group of people forcing their will onto the majority with brutal consequences for those that don't conform. We goes a bit further, not only doubting the motives of the benefactor in the one state, but unlike 1984, it also doubts the ability of the state to maintain control. There's a sense that these grand narratives and attempts to control society at all levels are doomed to collapse under their own weight and hubris. When it comes to big ideas to change the world, cynicism about the noble intentions and practical competence is often proportional to one's proximity to attempts to realize them. More broadly, dystopian stories reveal what utopias often deny, and many in our own society engage in contorted doublethink to ignore. The simple truth that every law, every tax, every mandate for the collective good is an implicit threat of violence. Sometimes the threat and the violence is justified, but we'd have a much freer, much saner, and probably more peaceful society if more people thought about it in those terms.